Look at this email. What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Joining me today on the podcast is Matthew Bounds, Senior Partner of Procurement Services at IBM. Matthew's background consists of more than 30 years of managing and leading diverse global teams and organizations. He has extensive experience in management, leadership, and transformation in both the U.S. Army and IBM Procurement Services, and is currently focused on transforming clients in the procurement outsourcing environment. Matthew, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Clint. Happy to be here.
So I always like to start with some background, and I'd like to think of the guests on my show kind of as superheroes, and every superhero has a backstory. So from serving your country in the Army, go Navy, by the way, sorry I had to put that in there, to being a global leader at IBM, can you share more about the path that led you to where you are today?
Absolutely. Let me just start a little bit about who I am. And, I am somebody that's been married almost 29 years to a former Army wife, and somebody who has dedicated her career to working with children with disabilities. I'm the father of 3 adult sons, 2 of which are outside the state of Colorado where I reside, one in Oregon and one in New York. I'm a musician by trade, a drummer, percussionist early on, enjoyed listening and playing music for a very long time now. I'm a veteran, as you pointed out, U.S. Army, serving with the 101st Airborne and the 3rd Infantry Division. I'm an active volunteer with a service mindset and, engaged with multiple organizations, both within IBM, where I work, as well as my local community here in Boulder, Colorado. I'm an avid reader. I like to think at times I'm a storyteller and, a world traveler based on my time in the Army, but also my time at IBM, working with my global colleagues, boots on the ground, if you will, in all the different locations around the world. My passion for travel and learning about others is really linked to my, we'll call it me being a world traveler. So that's a little bit about me, Clint. My professional journey really started with where I grew up. I grew up in a neighborhood south suburb of Chicago. We were all in the same socioeconomic status. Hardworking blue-collar folks that, in retrospect, really started firming my love and understanding of leadership, both the men and the women, my neighbors, and what they did were great role models for me to learn from them. In high school, I both played music and sports, and that was a great way to start your, call it, pre-adult journey, not having one clique to be in and understanding different people, right, being with the musicians and the athletes, if you will, and the teachers and then those that were the coaches really were in tune, was important to them to learning your trade and being attentive to your trade and hard work, all creating the success that was really expected of us when we grew up. The college I attended, North Georgia College. It's a senior military college. It's certainly a different way to get your undergraduate degree, either a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Arts. And I will tell you that, the purpose of that, outside of getting your education, is to prepare you to be an officer in the Army. And, that's where I started to hone, discipline and completing a task and working with others for a common mission, if you will. Being able to be a leader in that environment really transitioned me from a young man to an adult, if you will, and did prepare me very well to be an officer in the U.S. Army. The physical, mental challenges that we had in North Georgia really were something that I embraced, and building personal relationships around trust that last at least now 30 years is something that I will take from there. And these are some of the big impacts that have impacted my path to who I am today.
Wow. It's quite the journey from Chicago to North Georgia to now Colorado and around the world, I'm sure, in between. I share some of that background as well. I grew up in rural South Carolina, so blue collar. I'm only the second person to graduate from college in my whole family. My brother beat me only because I was in the Navy for 6 years while he snuck off to college. So
It's an interesting perspective, Clint, because my father was the first. The Bounds family's been in the United States for a very long time now, and my father was the first college graduate in the family, and I'm only the second. So I understand, we share that as well. I understand that, and that's a very impactful statement if you're talking with others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And my son, has been no doubt in his mind, he's going to college. And, that's it just kind of, I think once you get the ground set, then everything kind of follows, which is good. So my background is engineering, and I admittedly don't have a deep knowledge of procurement services. How do you define procurement services? And can you walk us through what this more commonly looks like for you and your team on a day-to-day basis?
I'll keep it as simple as I can. Procurement outsourcing or procurement services is transferring specific procurement activities. So, strategic sourcing or purchasing, tactical buying, transaction management, if you will, to a procurement provider. And in turn, this company that is outsourcing this work is doing so because it expects an increase in this procurement core competency. It's intended to reduce the overall cost that procurement can enable, and ultimately impacting the bottom line savings. For me and the team and my team, we're looking at delivering these world-class productivity and cost optimizations. We do that through having a set of practitioners around the globe, guys and gals that are the top talent in their domain, if you will. We utilize technology, as you would expect, from IBM, to turning this information into insights and outcomes, within the procurement process. We leverage strategic partners across the different categories that we have to eventually have a smarter and a more efficient procurement program. We execute this day in and day out, either from client sites, again, globally across the world, and every major city you can think of, center of excellences that we have, commingled our talent, and of course, delivery centers that we have in multiple cities as well.
So from a very simplistic standpoint, I think of my own world. And so procurement would be the person who's sitting there buying the widget or buying the parts or getting in the temporary personnel, but it's much bigger than that, is what I'm hearing you say.
It is. And because we're trying to take a look at that purchasing of labor, if you will, we're trying to do that not just at a one location or one manufacturing plant, if you will. We're trying to connect the full purchasing of labor that you may have globally. And there's different skill sets. So you talked about yourself as a working and project manager. We may have a set of project managers. You may have a set of legal requirements. You may have guys and gals that are working on shipping and receiving. All of that labor we try to put in one category strategy, and ultimately work with different suppliers and vendors to deliver that to you as the recipient. Again, give you a service that is impacting your bottom line and improves overall your customer service within your customer base, or you're in your company rather, but also with your end customers.
Well, I have a success story for you then, because I remember working with a client out in California a few years ago that manufactures agricultural equipment. And we're just going around the room introducing, and I always like to ask the question, how long have you been with the company? And I got to this one guy and he says, I'm not sure how to answer your question. He says, I've been sitting at the same desk doing the same job for 22 years, but I've only gotten a paycheck from this company for 2. The previous 20 was from IBM. So he was one of your outsourced solutions, apparently, for quite a long time. What's something you wish more people knew about the procurement services industry and your line of work?
That is a great question, Clint, because, procurement as a trade often gets looked at as boring. And, I view the domain of procurement is personable, very personable. You're interacting with individuals on a day-to-day basis, whether within your own company, within your client, or within your supplier base. And, we're talking real money and real impact to the bottom line. A lot of people don't know this, but there was a survey done a few years ago. There's $100 trillion US dollars that's transacted annually as companies purchase from each other, either a good or a service. And so that's, procurement practitioners are right in the middle of that. They are, completing the activity that's purchasing the good or the service, and ultimately impacting the bottom line with its daily operations. So again, personable and impactful are the two of the terms I like to use, whether you're doing it for our own company or you're doing it for another company like we are in an outsourced environment. And, most people just don't think of it that way, Clint.
Yeah. Well, it's all the P's: procurement, personable. What about experience? How has COVID really affected the work you guys are doing? I'm assuming it's had some impact.
It has, especially for our teammates that are on client site day in and day out, or those who are working in center of operations, center of excellence, or delivery center. Everybody went home to their home, and for those of us in North America or in Europe, we are certainly impacted. But those of our colleagues that worked out of India or the Philippines or Brazil, it's in where the family environment is very different. It's impacted. So now you're trying to do work in a different environment. Oftentimes, my colleagues in India are doing work with their mother and father in the same house, and the mother and father who didn't grow up in outsourcing or in the business world are now getting to watch their son or daughter do work. And I guess that's a positive thing, but it impacted the communication, right? Either the day-to-day experience of either working side by side with your colleague or working face to face with our customers was a big piece. And some people embraced that and were okay with it, and other people's that were different. And I share the example of our colleagues in India because very often people don't think about, they personalize it. We all personalize everything. But what is happening if you are in, where I sit here in Boulder, Colorado is very different from what's happened in other countries around the world and other situations around the world. But our communication, I feel like, we use video conferencing quite a bit, and that helped bridge some of the gap, if you will, with the initial COVID push as we continued to deliver. Our work didn't stop, Clint, but how we did get changed just a little.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that only 3 years ago Zoom was something on a camera, not a verb, right? We're going to Zoom now. So. Absolutely. You've been at IBM, I think, since around 2001, joining the company as a procurement professional and then working your way up to where you are now, which is a senior partner. When you reflect on your journey and professional growth during this 20 plus years, what's an accomplishment you think you're most proud of?
In 2014, I was asked to go and lead and build what is our delivery organization for procurement services. It was an organization that had struggled in the past, and I was asked to take that on. It was my first global role at IBM, where I had responsibility and for team members all over the world. And it was something that I walked into that wasn't necessarily built as it is today. And the output of that is still resonates and is still successful. I'm very proud of that. And, both think about it from how the external analyst views our delivery organization is still very high. We continue to get high markings from the external analysts on how this team now operates. We grew our business over 300%, and, that right there from a fiscal perspective is something that's important. Best in class remarks for both engagement within our team, but also our NPS score or Net Promoter Score. It's how our clients relate us has continued to grow up and started basically from zero, and it's what we call our top quadrant now. Able to create an inclusive culture within the organization, in doing that by building a leadership team that wasn't, U.S. based or European based. It truly had a global view. So you're getting that global perspective. Making it a priority for awareness on cultural events. International Women's Day, right, resonates with everybody as an example. Those type of things. So being asked to build something. IBM giving the time to not knowing it was going to happen in even 12 months. It took several years to create the success we've had, and being able to grow it profitably to the level it did, but also having some of those qualitative pieces around engagement and the NPS score and the cultural side of things really gives me a lot of pride that we were able to do that. And knowing that it wasn't a individual accomplishment for me, it was a team accomplishment with all the different leaders. And ultimately had about 20 leaders that were part of building this organization that finished, if you will. It's still there today, obviously, but where we finished it from that initial build to where we started, all people, diverse globally, not just diversity from a male or female standpoint, but from a global standpoint, and boots on the ground in the different geos.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. At what point in your career did you discover your passion for leading teams?
Well, I would say there are many times that I could point, to my time as in the U.S. Army that would have that. In reflection, I will tell you that when I was young, I had an opportunity to work in an Italian restaurant, Enrico's, in the town that I grew up in. And, my job, my physical job was baking pizzas, but also working with the customer that was doing takeout. So it was a sit-in, dine-in, or takeout restaurant. And I was in high school. I started there in the summer, and it was one of those times reflecting. I got energy and enjoyment from leading the customer and the preparation for the customer in the kitchen. And what I mean by that is we had sandwiches, and we had pasta, and we had pizzas, and working with all my teammates to get all that together with the order. It was one side, and then the other side working with the customer who, came in, and hopefully they had a good experience, and trying to match those two. And again, Clint, in reflection, when I thought about it, what a great experience as a young individual growing up. This was not a chain restaurant. This was an individual restaurant from an immigrant that had started this and grew it to a successful restaurant. So you had the pressure to, get all that together. And it was really the first time where I realized I got energy from, having to use communication, although I didn't know it at the time, having to use empathy, although I didn't know it at the time, having to communicate both inside to the team getting ready for the order, but also to the customer coming in, and also using humor is a way to oftentimes diffuse a prickly situation. Again, either with the customer paying for the takeout, or somebody within the kitchen staff that was a bit under stress. So that's probably the first time in reflection that I look back and I said, wow, I get energy from leading teams and being involved in an environment like that.
I'm glad we're doing this interview after lunch, because otherwise I'd be hungry right about now. But I think that's good, because I agree. I get energy from working with teams as well, and it's become my passion point in life. So I totally get that. I've heard in another interview you say, quote, "We rethink procurement to transform your business," end quote. This is your why, you said. I want to narrow in on the word rethink first. What does that really mean to you?
Yeah. Simon Sinek, great. If you have a chance to read anything, and it sounds like you have, he's wonderful and really, really helpful to organizations. For us, when we think, when I am saying rethink in this specific situation, it's meaning to challenge, but not in an arrogant way. And challenging how it's done today. And we know that with most journeys in the business sense, or even personal, going from point A to point B is never in a straight line, right? And everybody has their own journey. Their own pace of that journey is different. So it's how do you evolve, and how do you use your own experiences to rethink what is currently being done. And, so on a simple level, that's what I mean by rethink, is let's sit down and, again, non-arrogant, use experiences that we have, technology that we have to look at something in a different way that it's being done before. And knowing that even in that journey to rethink, it's not a straight line. There's going to be, up, down, left, right before you get to where you end up. That
makes sense. And in what ways do you cultivate a culture of innovation and creativity when you want to drive change?
First off, making sure everybody's engaged. and everybody, as you know, has a different personality and a different pace of work. So, making sure that everybody's engaged in the approach, hopefully both verbally and written, however the process is being done. And to do that, you have to set a comfortable environment that everybody feels that they can contribute regardless of the role. This is intended to produce a diversity of thought and experience, again, from that global team, right? People have grown up and have different experiences, which pushes their different approach to deciding and looking at things differently. But ultimately, if you can create an environment that has I matter and I belong in there, then that is ultimately where I have found you can get people to give their input and ultimately, help the greater good you're trying to do.
Right. This kind of ties in, I think, with my next question, which is, I read that, quote, building a strong community with a climate of communication and partnership, end quote, is something that drives you as a leader. What would you say are the keys to successful communication within these large teams you work with, more specifically teams such as yours that operate on a global level?
Yeah. First off, over communicate, and be very sincere and transparent in your communication. And if you can, do it the best you can, do it verbally. So, boots on the ground, talking to folks, looking them, eye to eye, if you will, in the same room or conference room, however you want to do that. And if you're not able to, utilizing the Zooms and the WebExes to make that happen. But, over communicate the best you can. No subject is ever off the table, right? Just know going in, you're going to answer every question, no matter how difficult it is. And, if I don't know, it's okay. I don't know. But that transparent communication where you're able to look somebody in the eye and give some information, but also answer questions, I think is very important. Respect all cultures, and work hard to understand experience. I have a great experience where I was in Budapest for the first time as a leader. I had a all hands round table, if you will, with my leadership, and I walk in and I gave some information and was looking for information as part of the round table, and the team was very quiet. And that culture, that age of in being in Hungary, it took a while for them to get comfortable with me and trust me to give the feedback. Versus you'll go to another location, we'll pick on the United States or the UK, very open to give information immediately. So understanding the different cultures is very important. Colleagues and teammates, they know when you're authentic, and everybody has their own authenticity. So make sure you're authentic, and, keep watch over your ego. People see ego and see that as well. So those are just a few that I try to use to create the success that I've been able to do.
Well, I really appreciated those comments because I think you're right. You really can't over communicate. I actually opened this podcast with the quote from George Bernard Shaw that says, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And it's so easy to just drop a text message or post something on Jira or Slack or, shoot a quick email and walk away thinking I'm done. And it's a lot harder, yet it gains clarity when you actually have a conversation with somebody. And I would agree there's research behind it that supports this, but when you're in the same room together, eyeball to eyeball, there is a deeper connection about the topic at hand than even there is through Zoom, because I can only see your head. I can't see, or any other tool, I can't see your body language in its entirety. And half the time people have you on, the camera's off. You can't really see what they're doing. So it's a lot harder to pick up on those nonverbal cues. So I do think that it's hard to over communicate. And I like to communicate through a conversation, through an actual dialogue, because to your point, in your situation in Hungary, you're expecting a dialogue, but it was a one-way speech. And we need that dialogue back and forth, because at the end of the day, if you had left the room without having really further dug into it, it would have just been your thoughts, and it wouldn't have been our thoughts and our concepts we came together with at the very end.
Absolutely. And you think about Japan, very different in how they interact to Australia, and that's considered in the same region of Asia Pac. South Korea as well. And I could go and again, that's one of the the blessings I've had is being able to have boots on the ground in each geo, many countries, has given me that lesson, right? You learn blunt trauma and mindless repetition, as I like to say. And so in that specific case, there was some blunt trauma there that I took with me to make sure that wasn't going to happen again, regardless where I went.
Yeah, the culture thing is also interesting because not only is there the culture piece of will somebody engage, and I can talk about Japan because I've been there quite a few times, and the Japanese actually, so our philosophy in the U.S. tends to be, we'll come to the meeting, we'll figure it out. The Japanese culture is, no. I want to have it figured out before the meeting shows up, before I show up at the meeting, right? So I need to have homework before I get to the meeting. And then the other one is just some of the language issues. I remember one of my colleagues turned me on to this idea thankfully early on in my visit, but you've been having a conversation with somebody and they're looking at you, nodding their head, going, hi. And I think the literal translation is okay, but it's not really what it means. It means I understand you're saying words, but I'm not agreeing to those words. Whereas, normally in the U.S., if somebody's nodding, you're like, okay, they're agreeing with me. And then you get to the end, it's like, that's not what I didn't agree to that at all. So you got to pick up on these cultural things for sure.
Absolutely.
What advice would you give someone interested in pursuing a career similar to yours?
Well, from the procurement services, when I was at the University of Tennessee getting my master's, and I fell into procurement. I was studying getting my MBA and studying supply chain and procurement, and I was attracted to the procurement guys and gals that were teaching, and of course I happened to be fortunate enough to working for the university and within essentially what I lead to now, and we were doing third party outsourcing for logistics at the time, and so I would tell people that before you decide maybe on a domain, if you will, rather be procurement in this case for me, find out what gives you energy, find out what gives you excitement. I talked earlier about working in the restaurant. At the time I didn't know, but I realized later that I was able to get and do get energy from working within teams and leading teams and being part of a team. So find something that gives you energy and that's maybe outside of a domain, if you will, whether it's law or in this case, procurement. And maybe start there. And the only way to do that is have multiple life experiences. So I can't, whether, I've worked in a restaurant all the way through, working construction all the way through, was in the Army before I got in here. I'm not saying you need to do that, but try to have as many different experiences as you can. And that if you are interested in procurement, that again, it's personable and it can impact, and there are a lot of ways to do so. And I'm a big believer in, in this case, for IBM as a big company, you have a lot of work, a lot of different things you can do within that company. But that was my option. There are you can do something similar in smaller companies too. You can work in purchasing or procurement. You can work in legal. You can work in accounting. You can work in manufacturing, whatever it is. So just be curious and inquisitive and maybe not lock yourself down, if you will, until you understand what you enjoy best.
Are there any leadership principles that speak to you personally and guide your day-to-day behaviors?
You talked about COVID earlier. When COVID hit, I had to, was going out and being on site, boots on the ground again, multiple client sites and meeting with the team. And it really caused me to reflect on essentially what you're talking about, leadership principles. Manage your energy, not your time, is a big one that I think about every day. I try to move the needle, if you will, every day. And, especially I remember thinking about COVID, it was a really unique time, but I try to move the needle, and I determine that by doing a daily respective, both work and personal. So I don't just focus on work, both personal as well, to make sure that I'm doing so. I try to thread a bit of humor in every meeting and every transaction I have. That keeps me positive, and it to me gets, it helps, get through the grind, if you will. Again, I like to try to do things that build a strong community. That gives me joy. So that's probably what I would lead with on that one, Clint.
Okay. What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
For me, I'll call it one-time advice or standalone, maybe something you read. It really hasn't resonated with me. I have been more the one that has really embraced what has been modeled for me over time. And what I mean by that is, my grandfather always enjoyed the moment that he was in, right? And you knew it, right? He was in the moment and he enjoyed it. My father always treated everybody with respect and dignity, no matter what his education was or his job was, and that was modeled for me from early on. My mom was always really curious, right? She was always curious and reading. So that modeling, was I will give you those. However, the one piece of advice that was given to me as a statement, if you will, that I have tried to and I have taken advantage of, which has both matured me in my career and life, was my mentor at IBM, Tim Humphreys, a wonderful gentleman. I just was a newly IBM executive, and he said, Matthew, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to volunteer at IBM. Don't turn any down. And it was a wonderful piece of advice. And I'm talking mentoring, speaking at events, giving your thoughts, and it just, unfortunately, not everybody does that. And Tim made a recommendation, and I listened to it. And it was probably the single best piece of advice I've had at IBM. That was call it that single thread. So that's probably where I would sit with that.
That's great. I hadn't thought of that. You're right. Not everybody really thinks about those volunteer opportunities as maybe career enhancing or personally enhancing as well, personal growth.
Yeah, and there's a program we have at IBM called P-Tech that is at the high school level. It's a program we have where essentially it goes into low-income high schools and allows students who are chosen, who earn the right to be in the program, where they have 3 years at the high school, and then the last 2 years at the local university or junior college, and then you come out of the 5-year program with an associate's. And I'm involved with that here in Colorado, and it's a wonderful program. It's one of those where it's in your community physically, but it's also part of your corporate culture, and it's given me a lot of great enjoyment, both working at IBM and also at the local high school here.
Wow, that's a great experience. What's the best book or article you've read recently, and what was the key takeaway? I know you mentioned Simon Sinek earlier, but is there, I don't know if that's the one, or if you read one more recently that you'd like to talk about?
Well, Simon, like a lot of this, I find him podcasts, and you'll see him come up on different podcasts and, editorials and things. One that's probably 5 or 6 years old now that is in the top of my list that I look at frequently is Tribe by Sebastian Junger. And, that really resonated with me when I read it, and I've gone back, talk about one community, the focus on the shared humanity, the people are more united during conflict or more than tough times, and we're all in this together mentality. I think that I went back to actually read it during COVID, and it's a great piece. And he's a great author on a lot of different levels. A book that I also keep at the top of my list that I think is misunderstood quite a bit is written by Kim Scott. It's the Radical Candor book. A lot of people look at it as, I'm not sure they understand what her purpose is, and, caring personally and challenging individually is one of her phrases, or, giving a damn about your team is another. I'm paraphrasing. And, a lot of the stuff that you and I learned in the military service, you with the Navy, me in the Army, I look at that book as a corporate version, a lot of what we learned through, blunt trauma and experience, and, her experience in the technology industry. I think there's some great pieces for that. The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday, it's the bestseller now for a long time. I really enjoy a lot of his podcasts, and I think there's a lot of good. Even if you take one little thread from his piece, I think it's worth listening to. I really do. So, those are 3 that I go to relatively frequently, if you will, both reading and listening.
Well, I'm going to add all 3 of those to my list then, because I haven't read any of those. So we're going to tie this all together, going back to earlier in the conversation. I think you said you were a percussionist. So who's the best drummer in the world, not named Matthew Bound?
Well, I will tell you, I'll give you the most influential to me. And obviously, Neil Peart, from Rush, passed away. He was a huge influence on me. One that's often not talked about as much is Stuart Copeland, who was a drummer for the Police. They only released 5 albums, and so they were short, but he did some great work on there. And, those are 2 that were very influential to me. There are a lot of jazz drummers you probably have heard of that were also influential to me as well. But, those 2, I think are worth listening to and understanding how they blossomed think about Taylor Hawkins, the Foo Fighters, who also unfortunately just passed. I guarantee he was influenced by both of those tremendously. And, the influence that we have, whether you're a drummer or whether you're a business professional or Clint like yourself, getting people together to listen to podcasts, I think sometimes we forget that, we have more influence maybe than we would like to either give ourselves credit for or maybe we don't think about.
I'm glad you mentioned jazz because I'm a big jazz fan. So I'm always happy to hear because when I think of drums and jazz, it's just a little, the metal things. It's not like the guy with the long hair just banging away, like you think of in the rock band. So, we had mentioned earlier before we started recording officially, you went to college in North Georgia, which you did say on the podcast, but you mentioned playing some gigs down around Atlanta and some bands we were talking about. So, yes, I'm a huge Driving and Crying fan, but I think Driving and Crying with Kevin Kinney is better than Driving and Crying without Kevin Kinney.
Yeah, I mean, he's a great singer-songwriter. A lot of people didn't really, they looked at him as a band guy, but versus his lyrics and his creativity, absolutely. And of course, Atlanta's over the years has had a tremendous amount of musical influence, over the decades. It's just a really musical hotbed. A lot of people don't recognize that.
No, Kevin Kinney went out on his own, and I still think I really like the original Driving and Crying albums and with him, but I also liked his standalone stuff he did afterwards. And, we were just reminiscing, and we'll close here pretty soon. But, when I was at Georgia Tech here in Atlanta, one of the other radio stations that was kind of popular was Album 88, which was at Georgia State's university radio station. And they played stuff that the regular radio stations weren't playing yet, which would have been the Kevin Kinneys and the Driving and Cryings. And that's the first place I ever heard it was on Album 88, long before 99X came out and kind of took over that spot on the radio dial. But anyway, I don't want to get too far along on music. Matthew, this has really been great. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Well, I've enjoyed it myself, Clint. So thank you for the time and appreciate you giving me consideration for us to have the talk today.
No, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.